I'm Janice Stein, the chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize jury for the best book written in English in international affairs. And I am just delighted to have with me Carter Malkasian, who has written what is an absolutely brilliant book, The American War in Afghanistan. There is so much to learn from this book, and then add to the delight somebody who is just a naturally gifted writer, which makes this a gripping book to read, which can replace whatever novel you're reading now. Welcome, Carter. It's just a great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Janice. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate it. And I assure you, whatever writing abilities I have only come after much study and repeated attempts and many, many failures.
Well, that's how we all learn. Carter, tell us a little bit about the diverse periods in your career and how those multiple responsibilities you had shape the lens that you bring to Afghanistan.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And maybe it's easy to say that before I was in Afghanistan, I was a civilian advisor working in Iraq, working in Anbar province. And without going into the details of what was going on there, one of the things that struck me when I was there was how important it was to know the local language. Because I had seen Marines who knew how to speak Arabic. I cannot speak Arabic. And they'd immediately be able to establish a rapport. They'd have a better understanding of what was happening. They didn't have to spend time working through an interpreter. They were able to create trusting relationships with the people that they were working with. And so after I worked in Iraq for a few years, I left Iraq and I wanted to go work in Afghanistan. It really stuck with me that if I truly wanted to understand the place, I was going to have to learn how to speak one of the languages. And that really drove me to learn how to speak Pashto.
So exceptional, frankly, and that you did that, Carter. So few did, and so right, frankly.
No, so thank you. And I do want to highlight that. I mean, I met a lot of people who spoke Dari. And I spoke a lot of people who took the trouble to learn Pashto. A lot of Americans I saw that did that, and some of them are in the State Department still today, doing fantastic work. Some of them started as advisors with me and then went to work in the State Department after that. So I mean, I like to think that there were a group of people who were willing to take the shot at it.
How long did it take you to learn? Just for our listeners, how long did it take?
So before I went to Afghanistan in my job with the State Department, before that I had about 2 months of intensive learning of Pashto. And so that helped get the basis. And then once I was in Afghanistan, I could spend a lot of time with the interpreters who helped me, then spend time just talking to Afghans all the time, and then getting up every morning and memorizing and making sure I knew everything correctly and going through it again and again and again. So then after about 9 months, I could be functional without an interpreter. Now that's if there was a complicated conversation, then I'd want the interpreter there. And then after that, you progress slowly after that. And then of course you meet new challenges. Like after I left Helmand, where I spent 2 years as State Department. Then I spent time in Kabul, and from Kabul, I talked to people in Kabul, plus go all over the country. And then you encounter all these different dialects. And that could be very, very challenging to adapt your ear. It's really your ear more than your what you're saying to the different dialects. And some to this day I have a horrible time understanding.
But still, it is, I think, the most underappreciated asset that we have when we go abroad. If we can speak the language and not have the interpreter filter things through, it makes just a huge difference.
Yeah, I tell that to students all the time, that one of the things that you can do when you're getting a master's degree or as an undergraduate is learn a language. And I kick myself. I mean, I learned German, which isn't good anymore. I tried to learn French, which was always awful, but I kicked myself for not taking greater risks as an undergraduate to learn more languages. And so.
Now tell me, how did you become assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to General Dunford?
General Dunford, that does go back to Iraq when I was working with the Marines, and he was a colonel then. And he became exposed to some of my work and such, and was always interested. I didn't work for him back then, but he was interested in what I was doing. And then when he became commander of all U.S. forces in Afghanistan, by that time I'd already spent 2 years in Afghanistan, plus some time in the east of Afghanistan. And he had been aware of what I was doing. He had known the work I had. And so he said, why don't you come and be my senior advisor out here? And so that's how I ended up in Kabul with him. And that was for 17 months.
And did that give you a different window than you had as a member of the State Department? Did that give you a different perspective when you were his advisor, a closer inward look at the military perspective?
So yes, it did give me a different perspective. So for one thing, in those 2 years I spent with State Department, I was in a district, which is like a county in the United States. And I was in the south of Afghanistan. So one particular area, one particular geography, one particular type of operations, and very much concerned about what was happening at the local level, like how tribal leaders dealt with each other, what was the role of a mullah in a community, what land rights were and how people interacted over land. So some very nuanced, detailed issues.
Very important, though.
Oh, I definitely believe that. And so then when we got to, then I come to Kabul, and I see the country from a much broader lens. And so some of the solutions I thought that could have worked to help Garmsir, which is where I was more, I thought there were solutions like, well, at the top level, we can do more to select better leaders, or we can address land issues. When I got to the higher level, I realized how many demands a general and a president like President Karzai and our president like President Obama has upon them. How many different issues that they'd have to deal with. And dealing with any of the issues that I mentioned, like land issues or selecting better leaders, is going to take their time, is going to take their political capital. And they have to weigh that against other things. So I started to realize that some of the things that I was suggesting, they might have worked if they were implemented, but they were not feasible to be implemented. It was too hard to make those things happen.
You've just, Carter, you've just described the dilemma that beautifully, that runs through your whole book, that actually all wars are local wars to some extent. If you have a dissatisfied local population, the war can't succeed. But as you go up the ladder and then you get multiple demands and you get into a complex system, you actually can't do it. And that tension, I think, runs right through your book.
Yeah, the multiple demands that they create a lot of different issues. And so like a demand that might be in the United States to address something that has a high political salience in the United States may not be as important. In Afghanistan, and the other issues in Afghanistan that are important, but those can't be dealt with effectively.
Tell us a little more about what you observed. We'll come to what you saw in the United States and the decision-making problems that you had the chance to see. But tell us a little more about the tensions between Kabul and Helmand or Kandahar, and how that got in the way, in a sense, quite early on of a successful outcome.
So one of the most important tensions that exists here is that the leaders who were selected to be in charge of, say, Helmand or Kandahar, they're appointed from the top. They're appointed by Karzai or someone who's connected directly to him, like the Minister of Interior or his national security advisor. So those people will be appointed. And so when someone's appointed like that, what they tend to care about is making Kabul happy, making the person who appointed them happy. And that could involve kickbacks, that can involve pressing money up. It can also largely involve not worrying so much about what the people think on the ground, because they're not accountable to the people. And so there's an argument, and you can see this kind of play out, that some of these leaders like Gul Agha in Kandahar, Sher Mohammad Akhundzada in Helmand, there's a variety of other leaders in other places, that they weren't worried about maintaining the support of the locals. And therefore, they were willing to do more poppy production. They were willing to tax poppy production. They were willing to push out their competitors so they could have control of things. They were willing to let police abuses go by, because there wasn't a local kind of accountability where they would have had to run an election or some other appointment mechanism that would have had them removed. And so this is a tension that exists between Kabul and what's happening in the provinces. Now, there's some other complicating factors here that we have to wonder about, like even if there was an election or some other means of selection, would that have prevented these kind of warlord figures from becoming in power, or would they have rigged that too? Or would a majority tribe put their guy in power who then would have abused other people? So there's some other questions that exist here with it. But I think it's a good example of the tension that you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And that local national tension, so hard to resolve. And I think you're right that there are no easy solutions. There's nothing we can pull out of a textbook here. I'd say, well, that would have fixed it. Looking back, and I trace that, the serious problems that bedeviled the Allied effort to exactly what you just talked about, Carter. How early do you think the war was lost?
I'd say, first of all, I'd say our opportunities to succeed were always narrow. It was always going to be hard to do. And that's something that I also learned. When I was in Garmster, I was more optimistic. Even at the end, I was more optimistic that, especially in the past, there's different things we could have done to reach a better solution. The more time I spent in Afghanistan, the more time I spent in Kabul, and then the more time I spent in Washington, that made me more and more pessimistic over time. The best opportunities to reach a better solution were early in the conflict. And the two that stand out most was the failure to involve the Taliban in the political process, the bond process.
Right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning. And so, and the point maybe there is that it's just they started the bond process before the war was even over. They might have tried to wait a little bit, but probably as important, if not more important, is that there's an emergency law Jirga in June of 2002. So, 6 months after the country had fallen. And the purpose of that was to confirm the new government and set the process forward for the constitution to be created. The Taliban sent a letter forward asking to be involved in this. Now, with all these kind of letters the Taliban sent, we're not really sure exactly what was said and exactly what they were willing to do. It's all incredibly cloudy. But we do know that the United States refused it. We do know that Karzai thought it was a good idea, but the US leadership at the time said that we should not do that. Now, that's fundamentally a problem. And we can't say for sure, we can't say that would have led for peace. We can say that would have led to better opportunities and could have led to a shorter, better war. Now, the other opportunity was...
Just before we leave that one, Carter, I mean, that struck me anew as I was reading your book. There's a bigger story here about excluding defeated adversaries from the political process that follows. The high of the moral high ground of the winner, and what a dangerous decision that is, to exclude the defeated.
Yeah, and I think you're underlining another issue here that has broader strategic implication than many of the things we learn about on Afghanistan, and that's success is a pitfall.
Yes.
Success, and especially the kind of shock and awe success that occurred in 2001, breeds confidence. That breeds overconfidence, and with overconfidence comes neglecting other threats that could occur. Yeah. Believing that one understands the direction history is taking, when that's probably not the case, and that made us vulnerable to excluding the Taliban. It also made us vulnerable to not building up a better Afghan military early, which is one of the other big problems that existed then. And so I would take that. I know I'm jumping a little bit ahead in your questions here, but I would take that to say that's something we should be worried about with the Ukraine today. That as we look at the success that the Ukrainians have had, which certainly we applaud, we should be wary on our own side about becoming overconfident and not seeing the other weaknesses and problems that we have, and not seeing that history may not go in the direction we'd like it to go.
That is such wise advice, Carter, and it is so difficult. We'll come back to this, but it's so difficult to give in the moment because the temptation is so strong when you get a little bit of good news or there's a success, just to think that is the way of the future and not be mindful of the dangers. And we're just living that right now at this moment as you and I speak, frankly.
Yeah, definitely.
Carter, one interesting thing that comes out of the book is, and I may be putting words in your mouth here, so correct me if this is an overinterpretation of what I read, is the overconfidence of the generals who advised successive presidents that more troops would make a difference to the outcome. Whereas clearly in the period following 2006, unless I'm misreading, my sense is that you were skeptical that an additional surge of troops, which would not be a permanent deployment, would have actually changed the outcome. And yet that's the military advice that president after president got.
So so there's a few points there. So it's, first of all, I want to clarify that at that time, so I've had the benefit of retrospect in talking about this. At that time when that surge was occurring, that's when I went to Garmster as a part of the State Department effort. And so I wouldn't call myself a supporter of sending in the total number of troops that was sent in the end, but I also was not opposing it by any means. And the initial sending in of 21,000, to me at that time, that seemed like a good idea. The additional that were sent, at the time I was in Garmster by then, I wasn't really paying attention to the debate because I was immersed in things day to day. But when anyone, would say, hey, what side do you take in the debate? My answer was, well, I don't really care. Like, I'm here doing this. And if they don't send it, I think we can do fine. If they do send it, well, I'm happy to have more forces here to help. That was kind of my attitude on it. In retrospect and looking at it more and seeing how it's all played out, I give a lot more respect to the attitudes of my friend Cale Weston, who's written his own book and spent 7 years in Iraq and Afghanistan with State Department. And his attitude was always, don't put in more troops. This is a conflict that's going to take a lot of time. The answer to this problem, or it's not really an answer, the only thing you can do here is, if you care about Afghanistan, you have to have a small amount of troops and plan to be there for a long period of time, because this won't be solved quickly. And if you remove the troops, things are going to go bad. If you put in more, it's not going to change how hard it is. So his advice, I think, I found it wise at the time. At this time, I find, in retrospect, I find it even wiser.
Yeah.
So that I agree. Now, in terms of the generals at the time, the generals in their debate with President Obama, I'd say, did not provide enough options. Yes, they were overconfident in what the successes that surge in troops could bring. The larger strategic mistake, I think, is not presenting more options. It's perfectly human for people to believe that their strategy is going to work.
And your instruments are going to work.
Right, and to believe that. But the thing to do from a strategic point of view is understand that one is going to have beliefs and therefore present different options. But understand also that just because you think it could succeed doesn't mean it will succeed. And we can't predict the future. So present different options. The option my friend Cale laid out. Another option would have been to leave entirely. Another option could have been just a surge with a smaller number of forces. So there's a variety of options there that could have worked, and that debate didn't consider enough of those options. And in order to find one that could have saved us lives and time. In terms of how the generals, the last point on this question, in terms of how generals felt after that. So I know in the press and in some testimony, some generals and some officers would say, and this is after 2009 and the surge, they would say, well, we can, if the Afghans will get there, if we give them a little bit more help, if we just give some more training, things will get better, or put in a small number of troops, don't withdraw this many troops. But that discussion is not what I saw represented at the senior levels. At the senior levels, the senior generals who had authority, not ones that were on the ground in some place, or someone who had just retired, or someone that was in a different position. The people in authority by 2013, what they were saying was that, and this is, General Dempsey, General Dunford, General Miller spoke in this regard. So what they would say is that if you're going to, if you want to protect U.S. interests and prevent a terrorist attack, our troops there help suppress that terrorist attack. If you pull out those troops, the intelligence says that terrorist attack is going to get worse. It's not our job to evaluate that. It's that of the intelligence agencies. But if we keep troops in, it will not improve the situation. It will not enable Afghanistan to stand on its own. It will not create victory. All that keeping troops in is take care of this particular terrorist concern that we have. And so they were, very forthright on that particular point. So it was really, they were not going to, they did not think that we could win in any kind of winning sense. Now, the flip side of this also is that there is a concern amongst the military about not losing.
Yeah.
And not being on the losing end of a war, which raises, some questions about how much did concerns about not losing affect the decision-making process. And I think that's something future historians should look at, especially when we're talking about the period of 2011 onward. The only thing I would say on that point, though, is the generals never would have had a leg to stand on if it wasn't for the sense of a terrorist threat to the United States.
Yeah. If you were designing a process, Carter, based on what you've seen, going forward to get more options on the table, because that is such, that is right, and then to get those options carefully looked at. None of us, there's not a drawing board here where there's not a formula to do this. But in the context of fear of a renewed attack that defined the United States from 9/11 on, how would you jigger the process going forward to get more options on the table? What do you need to fix?
I worry a little bit that my answer might be a bit naive on this. And
That's okay.
Maybe I'm too much of a professor. So I think on the one hand, generals need to recognize this. Since generals and admirals are the ones that we're talking about military options, they're the ones that tend to originate with the military options. So part of the education, the discussions that should come out of Afghanistan, the Afghanistan experience, is the importance of talking about different options and making that a part of when generals and leaders are trained to do things, that this receives more attention. And I guess that part isn't exactly easy because there's a lot of ways that training occurs these days, which can be a little bit too rote sometimes or too much focused on how to create a good plan, when it should be more about it's not creating one plan, you have to create several options or several different plans. So that's part of the other part of those on the political side. The president should be and Secretary of Defense, and they should be asking for options and making sure they're getting it, and refusing to move forward if they're not receiving. And part of that is them saying it directly to the commanders, and part of it's them telling their national security staff that that's what they want to see, because civilians too can think, well, I know what the answer is, and this is what it should be.
Yeah.
So the national security staff should have the same kind of pressure put on, and so should the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD. And I think with that happening, we can get a system set in place where it's more used to having several options put forward.
I think that's absolutely key. And reading the book again, Carter, you could sense the frustration during the Obama administration.
Yeah.
I mean, you paint a vivid portrait of decision making during that period, where there was a frustration. The president articulated a frustration with a lack of options. We had not dissimilar experiences in Canada, I will say. And looking back, I think we need to be better at building in challenge functions at the moments these critical decisions get made. And it is really hard to do.
So I think there's some other ways to encourage options. One is civilians and military together, maybe not creating each option, but that if it's just military, it can tend to get reduced in the number of options. So civilian and military helps. The other thing that helps is talking with allies, because allies help provide a different point of view. And their own interests just naturally can highlight dangers that US decision makers might not see, or the United States might highlight dangers a Canadian decision maker doesn't see.
Right.
I mean, this is one of the best things about the Allied grand strategy process during the Second World War.
Yeah.
Is these different viewpoints and these different arguments
They got into the pipeline, right?
right?
Yeah.
And you could see that, well, this thought of Churchill's is very helpful and innovative. This thought of Churchill's is dangerous. And they were able to work through that. Or the Americans were too narrow-minded here, didn't understand the dangers of going into Europe early. And the experience of the British and the Canadians, and to some extent the Australians, helped guide that. So that's important. And the other smaller thing that helps a lot is listening to people who have a different opinion. And thinking, and now it doesn't, if the different opinion is crazy, that doesn't help much. But who have a different constructive opinion and taking that into account and listening to those criticisms. And that opinion can come from someone on a staff, which is something that a role that I've filled and that I obviously support, but it can also come from the press or other discussions that people are having.
Just before we turn to how this advice applies to the awful crisis that we're in right now, Carter and I are recording this at the end of March 2022. Let's just spend a minute on the withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021. It's not in your book, but oh my goodness, you must have watched that and put your head in your hands, is all I can say, Carter.
Well, it was hard. And so it was hard for, I think, all of us who had spent time in Afghanistan. And I mean, if you're in a policy-making position, you want to try to keep a little bit distance for the sake of your objectivity. But one has friends there, and you're talking to those friends. You see what's happening. You understand the risks that they're facing. At the same time, you see Americans, Canadians, British, all the allies putting out, really putting themselves in tremendous risk to help Afghans who were their friends. And tremendous risk for all of us who had friends there. And I'm not sure even that is, to me, that's actually the more poignant, difficult part of all this that I'm not sure we've all come to grips with. And I guess I don't know if we will come to grips with it. Just that.
Could that have been better planned, Carter? What went wrong? I mean, looking at it as an ally of the United States, there was puzzlement. I can only say that there wasn't a smoother execution.
There was always a chance once we decided to leave that something like this would play out. That was always in the cards, and it's difficult to execute a withdrawal. It's difficult to do it under military pressure. And some of the mistakes that one saw made, they can naturally occur in this kind of situation. So the best answer to having reduced the kind of confusion, tension that existed would have been more time. And I'm not criticizing President Biden's decision here at all to get out, but simply in retrospect, the thing that would have given the most ability to have planned out and put in place elements of withdrawal that would have been a little bit less chaotic, would have been more time attached to it. And I don't mean to, like, 120,000 people getting up. That is really impressive. So I don't mean to criticize it.
You know, it's interesting because there was so much allied criticism of the United States, and yet when you look at those numbers, the United States was able to fly out 120,000 people. We flew out 3,000. Now you're 10 times our size and you control the airport, but nevertheless, numbers do tell a story here, Carter.
Well, the Canadians have also taken in a lot of Afghans.
Yes, yes. You know, looking at it as somebody who's interested in military history, one question I had at the time was, why wasn't there a surge of forces before, once you knew you were leaving, so that you secure the capital and you secure the roads to the airport? It seemed like, was that a lack of time or a lack of options?
Well, that's probably a combination of a lack of time and a lack of options. And it does get to what we were talking about earlier. It's not overconfidence in this case, but it's planners, strategists, and policymakers need to be wary of thinking that we know how the future is going to play out. Yeah. And I think to believe that, to say that we thought we would have had more time, I think that's perfectly fair. But we should also think, okay, what if I'm wrong? What if it's not the most likely? And we shouldn't expect an Intel analyst, and I think Intel analysts are brilliant, but we shouldn't expect them to predict the future. Yeah. They can give us a sense of where things are going, and probably can't even give probabilities reasonably attached to that, though. No. So we should understand that when they say something to us that we don't know for sure if this is what's actually going to play out. But I mean, the time part is important here too. In that even with more options, the time was complicating things greatly.
You know, Carter, this is the best study by far, and I say that to all our listeners and people who are watching this on video. It's the best book on Afghanistan, the one that I learned most from, and I think readers will learn the most. Looking at the situation, again, we're at the end of March, looking at the situation that is unfolding right now in Ukraine, probably the gravest security crisis we've had since, I think, 1962, and the one with the potential for the worst set of outcomes. What lessons would you take from Afghanistan that you would say to the Secretary of Defense in Washington and to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff? Here's what I learned by being so up close in Afghanistan. Here's what to watch for.
So we mentioned the overconfidence piece already, so I'm not going to repeat that. The other thing...
That's a very, very important one. I think that one, I can't emphasize how important that is as we get these tactical changes in the battlefield and predictions that one side is winning. Don't over-respond to what you're seeing today, and don't let confidence run away with you here.
So I guess let me think if I can. I'll try 4 things and hope I can remember them all as I say them. 1, be wary of the fears of the moment. 9/11 happened, and that was a real attack on the West, and there were other attacks on the West after that. There was a terrorist threat. But that terrorist threat kept us in Afghanistan for a long time. And I think it's fair to say we may have overblown it. We may have been more fearful of that threat than the threat really was. So we need to think about that carefully with Putin now. How great is this threat really to us? That gets to point number 2. Keep our interests in mind. What are our interests in the Ukraine? How important has the Ukraine been to the West, to the balance of power, to international law and human rights overall? How important and critical is that for what we deem our interests to be? In Afghanistan, we overblew a bit how much those interests are. And I think, President Biden has said repeatedly We don't have, any major interest in Afghanistan. And even for me, it's hard to argue with them. So, but it took us 20 years to come back to that after we've had COVID and Ukraine and other things happen to make us a little bit more focused, a little more sober. So we want to be sober about that now. If we get more involved, we have to worry about getting stuck and not wanting, either thinking we can win in the future or not wanting to lose later on.
That's one of the most important. I don't want to interrupt because we've still got 3 and 4, but that's
one more to go after this.
Yeah. So this third one, not wanting to lose, is such a powerful dynamic. It certainly affected our performance in Afghanistan. We didn't want to lose. It's not so much winning as this extraordinary difficulty that we have in losing. I'm sure that is a powerful driver of Putin's decision making right now, not wanting to lose. It's got to be. If it weren't, it would violate everything you and I both know about military history. And I'm sure it's an existential fight for the Ukrainians. And so when you're in that world, it's very difficult to think of a way out of that world. What advice do you have? How do you put that not wanting to lose in a broader framework, Carter?
Well, for the United States, the first thing is be careful about how much we get involved. The more we get involved, the more likely that we're going to be worried about losing in this situation. And I think the other points I mentioned, I think I've already kind of shown my hand a little bit, that I question how much geostrategic interest we have there. So we want to be careful about how much we get involved, lest it pushes us in a position where might feel we have to lose. Now, you've done very, thank you for putting ourselves in Putin's shoes in this regard and realizing he too is going to be very worried about not losing. And he too is going to feel like he has to be committed to this. The easy thing to do here is to see if there's concessions that can be given. That, if he stops the fighting, then something is going to be given that's less than all of the Ukraine goes. That's a possibility. Now, then there's other harder things to think about. If he feels he can't, if not losing to him now means that he has to take Kiev, then we have to consider how that falls within our interests, if that is something we're willing to accept. But the thing that when we think about it, we probably have to think most about is what are the nuclear escalation risks? What's the risk of a greater war if we decide that we don't want him to do that and we're not going to let him have those things? So him not wanting to lose is really a very important component here about how much we're willing to accept, how much we're willing to concede.
That is such a powerfully important point. That is so important to remember, that not wanting to lose is one of the biggest triggers of escalation. And it's a big part of why we stay on and fight long after we've given up the prospect of winning. And who that serves and whether it serves the local population is, of course, exactly the point of your book, Carter.
Yeah, no, it does.
Now, you had a fourth. I interrupted you. There was one more.
Oh, thank you. The fourth one is understand how much we don't know. We're not experts in the Ukraine. There are some Americans who are, but most Americans and most policymakers are not. So we don't understand the local dynamics there. While we have great feeds from Twitter and on YouTube and a variety of other, and of course the cable news networks and the great work the journalists are doing, while we are seeing things, we decision makers still don't truly understand the situation on the ground. And that should give us caution about how much we want to presume we know if we're winning the war, or if the Ukrainians are winning the war, presume we know if the Russians are winning the war, or presume that we think that our actions are going to create greater success. We don't know how much our actions are making a difference. It's too cloudy right now. And so that's another important point. We don't know if the economic sanctions are making a difference, because we also don't know, the same thing about how much we don't know about Ukraine applies to Russia. We don't know how much the sanctions are making a difference. We don't know how much the assistance that the Ukrainians are receiving is helping. We can't draw those conclusions.
Thank you so much, Carter. What a great series of things to keep in mind as our leaders and our advisors who help our leaders navigate through. We don't know. Your modesty. We don't know. We don't know. Be skeptical. Always ask for more options than the ones that are on the table and think about those options. Talk to your allies, which President Biden is doing in a really extraordinary way. The consultative process that President Biden is engaged in, and I can tell you, as a Canadian, the amount of time he has spent talking to other leaders, I think, is a hallmark of this process. And then I learned from this book, the fear of losing imposes costs on all of us. So think carefully. Think carefully as you get more involved. And even if you're very involved and you see obstacles ahead, don't let the fear of losing be the only factor that shapes your agenda.
No, absolutely.
Great advice, Carter. And from somebody who saw this on the ground in a district in Helmand, saw this from work in Kabul, and then saw this close in Washington, all those perspectives, all those lenses, has written, I think, by far the best book. And I've written a book on Afghanistan, and this one is by far the best book that we've had.
Very kind, thank you.
Till now, and as I said, written with real style, and it is a compelling read. And I urge everybody to read this book. Take it with you, and you'll start on a weekend night, and it will just take over your weekend. Thank you, Carter, for joining me.
Thank you, Janice. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the wonderful questions and getting me to think further and broaden my own perspective.